The meeting was already underway when I walked in. I remember the fluorescent lights and the way everyone's eyes shifted as I took my seat. The screen displayed a red number, $180,000. Gone. The CFO spoke in that measured, corporate tone, the one people use when delivering bad news like it's a weather report. We've identified the responsible party, he said, and then he said my name. I felt the room tilt. My mouth opened, but nothing came out. The presentation continued as if I'd already confessed. A summary appeared on the screen, dates, approvals, decisions, all supposedly traced back to me. But I was staring at timestamps I didn't recognize, approvals I never gave. Someone thanked me for taking accountability. I hadn't said a word. Not one word. The meeting ended. People stood. Someone patted my shoulder in that pitying way that made my skin crawl. I sat frozen, staring at the numbers that were supposed to be my fault. And that's when it hit me, this wasn't a mistake. This was planned. After the meeting, my boss pulled me aside. His expression was sympathetic but final. This isn't the right moment to discuss what happened, he said. We need you to let this settle. Let it settle. As if the blame was sand that would naturally sink to the bottom. I tried to speak anyway. I told him the timeline didn't match. I told him I wasn't even in the office during the critical decision. He nodded like he was listening, but his eyes were already somewhere else. Around the office, something had shifted. Colleagues who normally greeted me in the morning now looked away. Someone actually said thank you to me for taking accountability, for words I had never spoken. The narrative had already hardened before I could defend myself. I was toxic now. Guilty. The woman who cost the company $180,000. I spent that evening alone at my desk, staring at the incident report they'd handed me. My name was there. But something was wrong. The approval timestamp didn't match anything I remembered doing. I pulled the report apart line by line. There it was, an approval logged at 2:47 p.m. on March 15th. The problem was obvious to me. I was in mandatory training that day. Mandatory. From 2 to 5 p.m. Every employee had to attend. I checked my calendar. It was still there. The meeting invitation with 20 other names. The attendance list showed me present. And yet this approval, the one that supposedly started the cascade of errors, had my name attached to it. My hands were shaking as I searched for the access logs. How could someone approve something using my credentials if I wasn't at a computer? I didn't have the permissions to check those logs myself. Not yet. But I knew someone who might. I closed my laptop and went home. Sleep didn't come. I just kept thinking about that timestamp. About how careful someone had been. And about how they'd forgotten to check whether I was actually in the building. The next morning, an email arrived from leadership. It was formal. Professional. Designed to close the door permanently. The subject line read, Incident Resolution, Financial Loss Documentation. The email reviewed the established facts of my error. Each sentence was constructed carefully, with citations to the report I'd already received. It wasn't written for me. It was written for anyone who might ask questions later. It was a wall of accountability, and my name was cemented into it. The language was the worst part. It didn't accuse. It assumed. Every phrase started with as documented or as confirmed. No one was arguing anymore. They were just stating facts that had already been decided. I forwarded the email to my personal account. Something told me I'd need it later. Then I reread the incident report again, searching for the name of whoever actually approved the transaction. It was there, but buried under layers of process and procedure. I wrote it down, Warren. Warren worked 3 floors up. I'd seen him in the elevator maybe twice. I didn't know his face well, but I was about to learn everything about his email account. I requested the minutes from the leadership meeting that supposedly discussed my error. It took 2 days to get them. When they arrived, I nearly fell out of my chair. The notes referenced a conversation about my known weaknesses in process management. Weaknesses. Plural. As if I had a history of failure. But this was the first time anyone had ever mentioned anything like this to me. Not in a review. Not in a conversation. Not even as a casual comment. And then I saw it. The notes were dated before the incident even happened. These minutes were from a meeting discussing problems that hadn't occurred yet. Or rather, problems that had been decided in advance, before I was blamed for them. Someone had written the ending before the story even started. I felt cold. Not scared. Cold and clear, like someone had flipped a switch inside me. I printed the minutes and added them to the file I was building. I wasn't building a defense anymore. I was building a timeline. And the timeline was starting to tell a different story than the one they'd told me. I spent the next week mapping the actual workflow. The legitimate workflow. Not the one in the incident report, the real one, as it actually existed. There were 4 approval stages for transactions of this size. 4. I traced the documentation. At stage 1, there was an approver. At stage 2, another one. At stage 3, another. And at stage 4, the one supposedly approved by me, there should have been yet another sign-off required. But according to the report, my approval was stage 3. That meant someone else signed off after me. I found their signature in the metadata. Then I found the 4th approver's email in the system and sent them a polite message asking about the timeline. They never responded. But they read it. I could see that in the system logs. What struck me most was realizing that at least 3 people had known about this loss before it was ever blamed on me. 3 people had their hands on this transaction after I supposedly approved it. And somehow, all 3 of them had agreed to tell the same story, that it was my mistake. By the 2nd week, I noticed something strange. The office felt lighter. Not around me, people were still uncomfortable. But everywhere else, there was a sense of relief. Like a collective exhale. The problem had been solved. The loss had been accounted for. Someone had been held responsible. The company could move forward. I watched them move forward without me. In meetings, people seemed calmer. The tension that had been present before my blame had landed was gone. I realized what had happened. I had absorbed something for them. Something bigger than just this one loss. I had absorbed their failure, their carelessness, their fear of the audit that everyone was whispering about. Nobody made eye contact with me in the break room. But among themselves, people laughed more, smiled more. I had become the weight they no longer had to carry. That's when I decided I would stop defending myself. I would stop trying to explain. I would become invisible, observant, and dangerous. I stopped sending emails explaining myself. I stopped bringing up the incident in conversations. I became quiet in meetings, taking notes while everyone else debated. I smiled at the right moments and said nothing when it mattered. And while I was silent, I was collecting. I submitted formal information requests for every document related to the loss. I asked for access logs, version histories, email chains, approval records, calendars, and meeting invitations. Each request was professional, routine, nothing that would raise a flag. Just a woman checking the details of her own case. Nothing unusual. The documents came slowly. Some arrived immediately. Others took weeks. But they all arrived. And I saved every single one, organizing them into folders on an encrypted drive. People began to relax around me. They thought my silence meant I'd accepted the blame. They had no idea that every silent moment was a moment of work. That while they thought I was broken, I was building something. Something that would matter. It started with the version history of the incident report. I requested the metadata, and what I found was damning. The document had been created on March 10th. The loss occurred on March 15th. So the report had been drafted 5 days before the incident it was supposedly documenting. That was impossible. Unless they'd known in advance what was going to happen. But it got worse. The file had been edited by 5 different people. Not just 1 or 2. 5. Warren had made edits. So had my boss. So had someone from the audit department. And 2 people from finance. Each of them had worked on this document, shaping it, refining it, making sure it told the story they wanted it to tell. And then they'd all agreed that my name would be at the center of it. I checked when each person had made their edits. The final revision had been made at 4:33 p.m. on March 14th. One day before the loss was discovered. One day. They had finalized the blame before anyone even knew about the money being missing. I sat very still when I realized that. Not angry. Not yet. Just clear. Crystal clear. They had planned this. And I had walked right into a story they'd written for me before I even knew a story existed. A senior colleague, someone I'd worked with for 3 years, asked if she could buy me coffee. We sat in a quiet cafe 2 blocks from the office. She ordered something with faux art and looked at me with genuine sadness. "I wanted to tell you something," she said. "Off the record." I waited. "You should move on gracefully," she said. "The company is going to move forward. And if you fight this, if you try to argue it, they'll just see you as someone who can't let things go. Someone who isn't a team player. You need to accept this and move to another company. Start fresh." The way she said it was kind. Almost maternal. But the message was a threat wrapped in a scarf. Move on, or be destroyed for fighting back. I thanked her for her concern. I told her I was thinking about my next steps. And I went home and added her name to my notes. Because her advice had just confirmed something critical, they knew they were guilty. If they thought they'd done nothing wrong, they wouldn't need to warn me. They wouldn't need to tell me to move gracefully. They would have confidence in the truth. But they didn't have confidence. They had fear. And fear was a tool I could use. I finally got the system logs. It took 3 formal requests and a conversation with someone in IT who didn't fully understand what I was asking for, but I got them. And there, in the clean, objective language of machine records, was the truth. My credentials had not been used to access the financial system during the critical window. Not once. Not for a single transaction. The system showed exactly which user had logged in, at what time, and what they'd accessed. And it wasn't me. It was Warren. Warren had logged in at 2:15 p.m. on March 15th, stayed in the system for 43 minutes, and initiated the transaction that led to the $180,000 loss. Then, later that same day, after the loss was discovered, someone had edited the logs to attach my approval to the transaction. Not deleted the logs. Edited them. There was a difference. And that difference was a crime. I had found it. The smoking gun. The proof. I printed the access logs and placed them in a folder marked Timeline, Verified Facts. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. From something colder. From certainty. But doubt crept in anyway. It happened late at night, alone in my apartment, when the adrenaline wore off. A voice in my head that sounded like everyone else's voice asked, "Who would believe me?" I was blamed for a loss. I had motive to lie. What if the access logs could be explained? What if there was a legitimate reason for the timeline? And deeper than doubt came something worse, isolation. People at work had stopped inviting me to lunches. My boss's door was closed when I walked past. I wasn't included on emails I used to be on. The silence that had been my strategy was becoming my prison. I was disappearing from the company while still showing up every day. Some nights, I wondered if I should just quit. Take the senior colleague's advice and move on gracefully. Get another job at a company where I wasn't branded as the woman who'd lost $180,000. Where I could start over with a clean name. But then I'd pull out my files. I'd look at the access logs again. I'd read the document that had been written before the incident even happened. And the doubt would burn away into anger. Sharp, clean, focused anger. They had counted on the emotional cost breaking me. They had expected me to crack, to doubt myself, to slink away. But I wasn't cracking. I was using that anger like fuel. I was waiting for the elevator when Warren stepped in beside me. We didn't speak, but I could feel him being careful around me. He was uncomfortable. Good. 2 days later, I overheard him talking to another manager in a conference room. The door was cracked open, and I was passing by. His voice was casual, almost joking. He was telling a story about me. She bypassed the second approval entirely, he was saying. Just skipped it and went straight to sign off. I've never seen anything like it. Completely reckless. I kept walking. My heart was pounding. He had just described a step that had never existed for me. A step I was never assigned. A step that wasn't in the actual workflow. He had invented a detail to make his story more convincing. And in doing so, he had contradicted the official incident report, which described a different sequence of events. I went back to my desk and added this to my timeline. 3:15 p.m., March 22nd. Warren describes non-existent procedural step in conversation with manager name. Contradicts official report. He was panicking. And panicking people made mistakes. A week later, a follow-up memo arrived from leadership. It was subtle. Almost unnoticeable to someone who wasn't paying attention. But I had been paying attention to every word they'd written about me. This new memo clarified a few points from the original incident report. It adjusted the timeline slightly. It described the workflow in different language than the first document had used. The two documents now told slightly different stories about how the loss had occurred. Not drastically different, but enough that a careful reader would notice the inconsistency. I highlighted the differences in red. I saved the new document. I added a note. Leadership has revised the official narrative. See discrepancies between March 14th memo and March 28th memo. This was what I had been waiting for. Not just proof that I was innocent, but proof that they were lying. And more importantly, proof that they didn't have their story straight. If they weren't coordinating, if they weren't comparing notes, then they would contradict each other more and more as time went on. I had broken their confidence. They were improvising now. And every improvisation was a vulnerability. I pulled up my calendar and reread the mandatory training notification. March 15th, 2 p.m. to 5 p.m. Conference room 4B. Attendance required. The attendance list showed 30 names. I submitted a formal request for verification of attendance records. It came back 2 days later. Everyone had been signed in, including me. Now I had timestamps. I had system logs showing I wasn't in the financial system. And I had independent verification that I was physically in a different part of the building during the exact moment Warren was approving the transaction. The calendar conflict was absolute. Mathematical. Impossible to explain away. I added this to my timeline and then did something important. I created a summary document. Just 1 page. Just the facts. Access logs. Calendar. Attendance records. And the edited metadata of the incident report. Clean. Simple. Devastating. I didn't send it to anyone. Not yet. I just made sure it existed. Made sure it was ready. I requested the complete email chain related to the approval process. What I found was almost elegant in its deception. The approval request had been routed through the system, but the notification to my email account never came through. There was a gap. A missing message. Someone had manually intercepted it. The system logs showed the request had been created, flagged for my attention, and then manually removed from my queue. Not deleted, removed. Redirected to someone else instead. Warren. His name appeared in the audit trail. He had reassigned the approval to himself using administrator privileges. And then he had approved a transaction that had led to a $180,000 loss. And then he had blamed me. I added a note next to this discovery. Warren used administrative access to redirect approval from my queue to his. This explains how he could use my credentials in the initial report. He had access to reassign my roles in the system. The pieces were coming together. Not into a theory. Into a fact. Into a pattern of deliberate manipulation. I decided to take a risk. I sent an email to the system's administrator, a quiet woman named Rebecca who worked in IT. I didn't ask her for anything directly. I just asked if it was possible to alter access logs after the fact. Was it technically feasible? She responded within an hour. The answer was no, but not because it was impossible. Because it was detectable. Any alteration to historical logs would create a secondary record, a change log. It would show what had been modified and by whom. I asked if she could check whether the access logs related to the March 15th loss had been altered. She didn't respond for 2 days. I thought I'd scared her. But then a single sentence arrived in my inbox. No alterations detected. Logs are authentic. That was all I needed. The logs couldn't have been manipulated. They were original. They were real. And they showed Warren, not me. I added Rebecca's verification to my file and made a mental note. One ally. Not many. But one. After the first month of silence, Warren and the others seemed to relax. The investigation was closed. The loss had been accounted for. No audit was coming. No one was asking more questions. They'd gotten away with it. I watched them stop coordinating. In meetings, they stopped exchanging looks. In emails, they stopped being so careful with their language. They were confident now. Which meant they were sloppy. Someone must have told Warren that I'd accepted the blame. That I wasn't fighting back. That I was just going to disappear quietly into another job somewhere else. Because his behavior shifted. He became the Warren I'd heard about before this started. Casually arrogant, careless with details, expecting people to believe what he said because he said it with confidence. I watched him make mistakes. Small ones. But mistakes nonetheless. An email where he misremembered a timeline. A conversation where he described the transaction process incorrectly. Each mistake contradicted something he or someone else had said before. I documented every single one. It came in an email thread between Warren and my boss. Warren was explaining the loss to someone from another department. In his explanation, he described the approval process differently than he'd described it in the incident report. He mentioned a step that didn't exist in the original documentation. He suggested that I had created the loss through negligence, not through the system error that the incident report had implied. My boss replied, affirming Warren's version of events. But his email contradicted the memo he'd sent just weeks earlier, which had described a different sequence of events. Two versions. Two stories. Both in writing. Both signed. I printed the entire email thread, highlighted the contradictions in yellow, and added it to my file. This was what I'd been waiting for, not just proof that I was innocent, but proof that the people who had blamed me were inventing their own narratives without checking to make sure the narratives matched. They weren't coordinating anymore. They were improvising. And improvisation left fingerprints. I did something risky. I dug into the company's historical records. It took 2 full weekends, but I found it. 3 years earlier, there had been a similar loss. Another $180,000. The circumstances were almost identical. And it had been blamed on a different employee, a man named Robert who worked in the operations department. Robert had left the company 6 months later. Quietly. Without a recommendation. Without a reference. I pulled his personnel file using an access I technically shouldn't have had. But I'd learned by now that no one was watching. His file contained a termination letter that referenced the loss. The same language had been used. The same structure. The same careful, professional tone that left no room for explanation. And I recognized one of the names associated with that loss. Warren. He'd been involved in that one too. I added this discovery to my timeline with a simple note, pattern identified. Similar incident, same personnel, same outcome. Blamed employee leaves company. Suggests systematic scapegoating practice. This wasn't just about protecting my name anymore. This was about a pattern. A practice. Something that went deeper than one loss and one blame. I finally understood what this was really about. It wasn't the loss itself. The company could absorb $180,000. It hurt, but they could absorb it. What they couldn't absorb was an audit. And they were scheduled for an external audit in March. I found the memo announcing it. Dated February 20th. 1 week before the incident report had been created. An external audit meant scrutiny. It meant someone from outside the company would examine the financial processes. And if they found that loss during their examination, they'd want to know why it had happened and what had been done about it. They'd want to trace the error back to its source. But if the company could blame it on an individual, if they could say it was a personal failure, not a systemic problem, then the audit might see it as an isolated incident. An employee error. Not a reason to dig deeper into the company's financial controls. I'd been blamed not because I was guilty, but because I was convenient. Because it was faster to sacrifice one person than to admit that multiple leaders had been negligent. Because an external audit was coming, and the company needed to appear as if it had already handled the problem. I added this realization to my file. The timeline makes sense. Audit announced February 20th. Incident report created March 10th. Loss discovered March 15th. Blame assigned immediately. Solution: present loss as isolated employee error to external auditors. Now I understood. And now I knew exactly when and how to move. I could have gone to my boss with my findings. I could have sent an email to leadership with all my documentation. I could have made a scene and demanded vindication. But that would have given them time to respond, to coordinate, to explain, to create more narratives and contradictions. Instead, I waited. The external audit was scheduled for April 15th. 3 weeks away. I spent those 3 weeks organizing my findings into a clean, professional document. I prepared a summary. I created a presentation, complete with side-by-side comparisons of the contradictory statements they'd made. And then I waited for the official schedule to be released. When it came, I saw that there would be a kick-off meeting on April 14th. One day before the audit began. That morning, I arrived at work early. I printed out a single copy of my findings, just one. I walked to the senior leader's office, the one who'd signed off on my blame, and I placed the document on his desk with a simple cover note. Pre-read material for tomorrow's audit kickoff. Please review before we begin. My name. I didn't demand a meeting. I didn't ask for a response. I just left the document and went back to my desk. That was the moment everything changed. The kickoff meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. By 8:30 a.m., I could see panic in the office. People were moving quickly. Someone was on a phone call in a closed conference room. Warren looked like he hadn't slept. The meeting started an hour late. The senior leader opened it with the external auditors, and before they could even begin their questions, he distributed my document to everyone in the room. I wasn't there. I had been told not to attend the meeting. But I could imagine what was happening as they read it. As they saw the access logs. The calendar conflict. The edited document created before the incident. The changed narratives. The historical pattern. The facts I'd collected didn't accuse anyone. They didn't need to. They simply presented a sequence of events that made it impossible to believe the original story. When the meeting ended, no one came to talk to me. Not for 2 hours. Then my boss appeared at my desk. His face was grey. "We need to discuss the incident report," he said quietly. What happened over the next week was careful and measured. The external auditors expanded their investigation. They requested interviews with everyone involved in the loss. They examined the same documents I had examined. They reviewed the access logs. They confirmed the calendar conflict. And Warren's story fell apart. Under questioning, he couldn't explain the discrepancies. He offered different versions of events. He contradicted himself multiple times. The auditors documented every contradiction. My boss, when questioned, defended himself by saying he'd relied on Warren's initial findings. That he hadn't independently verified the information. That he'd trusted the process. That defense didn't hold up either. Within days, the audit's preliminary findings were shared with the company's executive team. The loss had been caused by a procedural error in the approval system, an error that Warren had failed to catch and then misattributed. The systematic failure involved multiple leaders who'd chosen to blame a single employee rather than admit the gap in oversight. I was cleared. Officially. In writing. My name was removed from all documentation related to the loss. The incident was reclassified as a system failure, not an employee failure. Warren was placed on administrative leave pending a review. My boss was transferred to a different department. The company apologized to me. They offered me a settlement and a promotion if I would stay. I listened to their offer and thanked them for it. Then I told them I would be taking a new job at another company. My last day came on a Thursday. I cleared out my desk quietly. A few people said goodbye. Most pretended not to notice I was leaving. That was fine. I didn't need their acknowledgement. Walking out of the building, I thought about what silence had cost me. A month of isolation. Sleepless nights. The constant weight of knowing something was wrong and not being able to speak about it. The fear that no one would believe me. The doubt that crept in when I was alone. But I also thought about what silence had given me. It had given me the ability to observe. To collect. To think clearly instead of react emotionally. It had given me time to build something that couldn't be argued with or dismissed. It had shown me that sometimes the most powerful response isn't speaking up immediately. It's waiting for the moment when your evidence speaks louder than anyone's words ever could. I had won. Not because I'd fought harder or spoken more loudly, but because I'd been patient. Because I'd documented the truth. Because I'd waited for the moment when facts would replace assumptions. As I walked out of that building for the last time, my name was cleared. The loss had been reclassified. And the people who'd blamed me were facing the consequences of their own actions. I didn't feel angry anymore. I felt something colder and cleaner. Vindication. Not revenge. Not destruction. Just the simple, powerful act of truth finally breaking through. And I walked into my new life with my integrity intact, knowing that my silence was never weakness. It was just patience.